Okay, here it's time to cut the spokes to length, and then we'll grind the ends and then we'll thread them. So here are the spokes we're using. There's some plain steel galvanised spokes. These ones have been a little bit water damaged in the Brisbane floods. In a wheelchair factory were given to me, but they'll do the job fine. So there's the spoke. It's already got a thread on the end, but it's too long. It's very common to find when you're making electric wheels that you can't get the right spoke length for what you need with the normal rim sizes and the big diameter motors. So I frequently have to cut spokes to a custom length. Now I've made up a jig for cutting spokes to length, which is very simple. It's just made of a piece of 12mm threaded rod and some square washers and a pair of nuts holding each washer in place. The nuts at this end have been locked on fairly tightly, and the ones at this end aren't so tight. And you can see there's a little hole, it's about 3mm I think, in each washer. So I can slip a spoke through and have it stick out that side. And you can see I've got the elbow of the spoke coming around that hole, and the head of the spoke isn't touching the washer. Now I've done a couple of test spokes in this, and I've got it so that when I cut the spokes with this pair of pliers, it'll cut it to the right length. And I'll cut one. I'll just check that. So the way you measure a spoke is to hook it over the end of the ruler like that at the elbow end, and what I want from these spokes is 198mm. Now just up to the ragged edge of the pliers cut, you can see it goes up to about 199, but by the time I've ground the end of the spoke flat, it should be about 198, which is what we want. So I'll just cut all of these the same way in that jig. Dang. Until I've got 36 spokes to length, and then I'll grind them.
Yep.
So after you've cut the spokes to length, you can see there's a bit of a ragged chisel point on the end there. Now that's no good for starting off, so I want to grind that square on this bench grinder, and then I want to grind a little bevel all the way around the end that makes it easier for the threading tool to start the thread. If you don't put a bit of a taper on the end of the spoke, the threading rollers can't get a grip on the spoke, and you end up going round and round in the same place. So I'll start the grinder. Now see how I spin the spoke while I'm grinding it square. That makes up for, that averages out any little inaccuracy you have in your squareness, and it gives quite a good end on the spoke. And now for grinding the bevel, I go underneath the wheel, and that way the burr dragged by the wheel comes on the end of the spoke and not on the side of the spoke where it would interfere with the thread. So again, I'll spin it between my fingers. To make a little tapered end like that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I want to show you the spoke threading machine I use. This is a Hozan C700 that I got from the English supplier. I'll put a link in. This has been a really good machine, quite cheap and very simple. I've added on a piece of angle iron at the bottom, a couple of bolts holding on. That makes it easier for me to clamp it onto a tabletop or a bench top. It's made with a base that's easy to put into a steel vise, but I usually do my spoke threading at the kitchen table, so this makes it easier. So this clamp here clamps it down onto a table. Now the spoke goes through a hole here. You always pull that back, push the spoke right up and tighten up the big wing nut. Now you can see here there's 3 threaded rollers that spin freely. Pull the spoke out, you can see they spin freely on their spindles, and they've got exactly the right spacing and the right angle to roll the thread onto the end of the spoke. So a spoke's thread isn't cut, it's rolled. This nut here enables you to tighten up this tapered thread and bring those rollers slightly closer together. It's important to have a close look at the threads you're making at first, or when you're getting a bit of trouble with them. Look through a hand lens or a magnifying glass. Sometimes you do have to tighten that up. Now I've got a little bit of damage to these rollers. You can see they're not perfectly smooth. Most of that seemed to have happened when I used them on a set of anodized stainless steel spokes that had some very hard coating on them, so I won't be threading them again. But these have been very good with all stainless steel and plain carbon steel spokes. Now before I use it, I always make sure it's well lubricated. I've got a light oil here, which is actually a mixture of chainsaw oil and kerosene. And every spoke that I thread, I dip in this before I thread it. Just make sure everything's spinning, well lubricated and spinning well. Now I'll put it in place and we'll thread a spoke. So here's the oily spoke, pushed in, tightened up. Now when we start threading, you have to push the handle in quite strongly to get the thread to start. And you know it's working when you can see the chuck moving away from the headstock. Now I've made a little piece of wood with a measured width on the end, and I go till that will go all the way down. And then I reverse the roller head off the end of the spoke. Now once I'm actually into production, what I actually do is I take this handle off, this crank handle off, and I put on a cordless drill, and that makes it fast. So here's our spoke threaded. It's a bit hard to see because it's all oily, and I'll just check that with a nipple to make sure that's all okay. So here's our thread. Now because it's rolled, the thread is actually a bigger diameter than the spoke itself. Now the spoke spins on there very nicely. It gets a little bit tight. Okay, here we are. We've taken off the crank handle from the spoke threader and we've put on a cordless drill, and this will speed the process up a fair bit. Now again, when we start off each thread, we've got to push the drill in this way to help the rollers get a grip on the end of the spoke. Otherwise they can just get stuck and spin around. So here it goes. That was fast, wasn't it?